Did Jews steal Palestine? It's a conflict that so many people argue about, and I've heard activists on both sides make statements that just sounded off. But I realized that I didn't really understand the history of how it began. And when you hear the arguments about it, they all have this element of, yes, but before that, this happened. So it's a long history, and it's understandable to be confused. I decided to start at the beginning of recorded human history and see what I could learn.
Okay guys, today I'm going to review a video by Ken LaCourte. His YouTube channel is Elephants in the Room, and his video is about the settlement of Palestine by the Jews, and he's trying to explain the history so that people can understand what's going on with the Jewish-Arab conflict in Palestine. I'm really only going to let him get into it for like 5 minutes because there's so much information that he leaves out that most of this video is just going to be me talking about the 1800s, and I'm only going to scratch the surface of what happened in this region because it's a huge story. I'll just get into it, and if you don't want to hear me talk, this is probably not the right video for you.
So here's what I learned about how both Jews and Arabs came to believe that the world's most contested real estate is rightfully theirs. I also tried hard to make it digestible without dumbing it down, and I really believe that within 20 minutes, you're going to be a lot smarter about this whole thing. We'll start with the very beginning, that saw a lot of players from history converge into one place. Then we'll look at Britain's impossible balancing act after World War I, a history of partition, war, and displacement that followed, and how a Palestinian identity was born. So let's start as close to the beginning as we can. The land that we now call Israel, or Palestine, has been inhabited for over 10,000 years. Archaeological evidence shows hunter-gatherers living there in the Stone Age, followed by some of the world's first agricultural settlements. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, was founded around 9000 BC. These weren't nations or kingdoms, they were more like scattered communities. By the Bronze Age, around 3000 BC, the land was called Canaan. It was a patchwork of city-states and various peoples. Egyptians, Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians, they all fought for control of it because of its trade routes. By around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age collapsed and the political map was once again redrawn. Out of that chaos, sometime around 1000 BC, Hebrew tribes emerged in the hill country of Canaan and began forming their own kingdoms. King David made Jerusalem his capital, and his son Solomon built the first temple there. That's how the city became sacred for Jews. But Jewish rule didn't last long. Their kingdoms fell, and they were exiled. Persia took over next and let the Jews return and rebuild. Then came the Greeks, the Romans, then the Byzantines. Each empire left behind language, culture, and architecture. After crushing 2 major Jewish revolts, the Romans renamed the province from Judea to Syria Palestina. Some historians say it was intended as an insult, meant to erase the Jewish identity, but in any event, Jewish sovereignty essentially ended there for almost 2,000 years. By the 600s, Muslim armies came in, bringing the Arabic language and Islamic rule. Jerusalem gained the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which are holy to Muslims as the site of Muhammad's night journey. For centuries, Islam defined the region with small groups of Christians and Jews still in the mix. Then came the Christian Crusaders, who captured Jerusalem and slaughtered thousands, only to lose it again to Saladin.
Okay, just real quick. Anyone who conquered the Holy Land slaughtered thousands. What happened? Saladin just walked in and peacefully took over the Holy Land from the Christians. He didn't slaughter anybody. He didn't slaughter thousands. Why would you even frame it in that manner in the first place?
The Ottomans took it over in the early 1500s and ruled it for the next 400 years. By the 1800s, the Holy Land was really a little corner of the Ottoman Empire. It was rural, poor, mostly Arab. It was roughly 80 to 95% Muslim, with small Christian and Jewish communities. There was no independent Palestine, no Jewish state, and no national borders, just one big empire that was starting to have trouble. In 1915, at the beginning of World War I, Britain encouraged the Arabs to rise up against the Turks to help defeat the crumbling Ottoman Empire, and promised to back their independence after the war.
All right, so we're just going to kind of cut in right here because this century, this is actually where everything important in the history of Palestine, this is where all the groundwork is laid. This is where all the juice is. This is where everything happens. And not just in Palestine, really across the world. The 1800s, that was the century that kind of wrote the playbook for the time that we're in now. We're really playing out a limited array of moves that were made available to us as a result of what happened in the 1800s. So this is a critical period of time across all of Europe, in America as well, but especially in Palestine. So we're going to kind of get into just a few of the things that happened there that set the stage for today. So this story really just begins with Palestine Place, and Palestine Place is in Bethnal, England, and it's the heart of the restorationist movement among Protestants. And the restorationists, they're following their own self-interest, and they want the Jews to have a homeland in Israel, but not out of any sort of care for the Jews. It's because they genuinely believe that the second coming is going to happen, and they need to facilitate that process by making sure the Jews return to their homeland first. So they're really serving themselves, but it's going to mingle with British imperial designs. And from there, it's going to get muddy big time once the Rothschilds get involved. But we'll start off with just the restorationists, and I'll just hit a few key figures here. We've got William Henry Black. William Henry Black is a preacher, and that is his pretext for going to Palestine. However, he operates almost within two domains, really. He is going to compile ethnographic and demographic reports in Palestine, but he's still going to have the cultural influence of a preacher. He's going to reframe Jewish restoration, not just as biblical destiny, but he's one of the guys who ties it to British imperial opportunity. So he's multifaceted. He's both acting in terms of just pure logistics for settlement purposes, but then also laying the cultural groundwork and the political groundwork at the same time through his preaching and through his efforts to tie restorationist efforts to British imperial efforts. So next we'll look at Joseph Barclay. He is an Anglican chaplain, and he actually becomes the Bishop of Jerusalem later. He also goes to Palestine under the pretext of missionary work, and he is there with consular protection as well. But he's going to document village structures, he's going to document Ottoman land customs, and he's also going to take note of infrastructure gaps. These surveys that he provides, they're very granular in their detail of subtle aspects that are very useful if you want to settle a land. And they don't disappear at all. In fact, they get reused later on by official Zionist institutions that later settle the land. So next we've got James Finn and his wife, Elizabeth Ann Finn. She's also going to come into the story. But James Finn, he's a British consul. He is the consul in Jerusalem from 1846 to 1863. He writes a book called Byways in Palestine, and it's like a settlement feasibility study that he writes. He gets into soil quality, labor habits, agricultural potential, very specific areas of study to write about that all pertain to settlement. So it's hard to think that this is by accident. And he actually runs early Jewish agricultural experiments outside of Jerusalem. And the phrase making the desert bloom, it actually refers to him and his efforts during this time. That's where this phrase was born that we hear today. So next we'll actually get to official engineers. There's two engineers here. They are part of the Palestinian Exploration Fund that's founded in 1865. And the Palestinian Exploration Fund, it sends two royal engineers, Claude Condor and Horatio Kitchener. And these two guys, they conduct the most detailed survey of Western Palestine produced at all before World War I. They take note of elevations, villages, water sources, roads, tribal boundaries. These guys even note where ruins are. Very detailed stuff. So they're clearly like not just symbolic maps. These are engineers, and they're creating operational maps that are going to be useful not just in World War I. Later on, Zionist settlement agencies that are created by the Rothschilds, they use these exact surveys when they're negotiating land purchases, when they're planning out their colonies, and even as they're arguing the feasibility of these settlements under both Ottoman and British law later on. But let's get back to Elizabeth Ann Finn real quick, because it's important to take note of the softer side of things here, because there's a whole cultural shift that emerges out of British restoration religious thought here, and it turns into a culture, and then from there it fuses with the politics, and it makes all of this possible just as much as the logistics in the mapping. But it begins soft. It begins with books, it begins with artists, it begins with missionaries returning home and sharing their stories. And Elizabeth Ann Finn, she's a great example of this. Elizabeth Ann Finn will run schools, she'll run vocational programs, and she'll run literacy projects for both Jews and Arabs in Palestine. And this sets the very groundwork for cultural expectations and also administrative habits that later line up perfectly with both British and Anglo-Jewish governance models that emerge. I'll leave off here. I could list 20 more people that operate both within the domain of logistics, like we were talking about, operate within the domain of culture, operate within the domain of religion. There's a ton more people involved in this, and I haven't even gotten into Lewis Way or Shaftesbury or Montefiore. There are a ton of characters in this story, but all of those characters, the plot that they're involved in this story, it occurs between 1800 and 1930s. Basically, Ken McCourt skipped the entire relevant part of this story if you want to understand what is happening in Palestine. He skipped the part that is the transition period from the old world into the industrial world and then into the modern day world. That's the point. That's the nexus where everything changes form. And if you don't understand that part, you will never, ever have a clue about what's happening in the Middle East today. There's a touch of irony here as well. If you watch his video, he's going to run an ad spot in it for a service that theoretically gives you context about the news and tells you what you're missing. And the preamble in his ad spot is that news reporters don't lie overtly. They mislead people by leaving out key context. And that's exactly what he did. He did the exact thing that his product is designed to solve in his ad spot. I will cut off this review at this point. That's a lot of information I just put out there. If this video hits numbers, then I'll just take that as a sign that people are into this subject and they want to know more. But this is literally the very tip of the iceberg. I could go on for 2 hours and just drop name after name after name. I can draw connections across the Atlantic to Zionism in the United States. We can talk about how the Palestine place later on influenced Darby and how his dispensationalism influenced Cyrus Ingersoll Schofield. We can get into D.L. Moody. This can go on and on and on. This is one big story, really. And again, there's so many characters. There's Lady Theodosia Powercourt. There is Henry Froude, who was one of the exclusive brethren, along with John Nelson Darby, who helped create dispensationalism. And Henry Froude was the guy in charge of the Oxford University Press that allowed for the printing of the Schofield Bible in the first place. So there's endless connections to draw here. They really begin with Bethnal and Palestine Place, but I don't want to just overwhelm you with these endless details. So if this video hits numbers, if I see a lot of comments being like, dude, tell us more about this period of history, I will go bananas for you, because this is one of the most interesting periods of time that I've devoted study to in the last couple of years, and I could talk about it for days. So I just don't actually know if there's an audience for this or if anyone wants to hear it. So I'm just going to throw this video out there. And like I said, I'll be able to tell if there's numbers that you guys are into it. If you did make it this far, please like, share, and subscribe and help the channel grow. Thank you so much for watching.